Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. There is a fascinating and I think potentially significant battle going on in the fight for the Democratic nomination in an important and interesting district, the district in New Jersey that includes both Newark and I believe parts of Jersey City and surrounding environs as well. But my next guest can explain that better than I can. There is a long-term Democratic incumbent in that seat, and I think it's fair to say that it's one of those races where the Democratic primary probably decides who the next representative from that district is going to be. The long-term incumbent Donald Payne Jr., who succeeded his own father in that position, is facing a challenge from my guest. My guest, Imani Oakley, is running as a progressive challenger, again, in a congressional district in New Jersey. I believe it's the 10th congressional district, and she joins us now. So first of all, Imani Oakley, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited about this conversation today.
Well, we're excited to have you, and I wanted to start out by asking you, how do I put this? Well, first of all, let's go back even before the race. What's your own background, just so our listeners know you a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So I have actually lived in the district most of my entire life. I moved one time from the apartment down the street to the house I'm sitting in now. And actually, my family almost lost this house to foreclosure. We have a real issue with foreclosures in New Jersey. Actually, as of 2019, we were number one, not only in the state, but in the country. This district was number one in the country for foreclosures. So it's a real problem here. And, my story is actually pretty lucky because I actually have a brother who moved into the house with his partner while me and my mom moved out to a small apartment in Newark. And my mother would pay the taxes while my brother would pay on the mortgage. And that's how we were able to, save the house through all that finagling. So my story is actually, at least positive in comparison to other folks in the district. But, besides those 4 years, I've lived in the district my entire life. And I've also worked in politics in New Jersey on all levels. So I worked on the federal level. Straight out of law school, I went to work for the United States Senate, where I was a constituent advocate. My portfolio, actually, interestingly enough, consisted of issues regarding housing affordability, foreclosures and mortgage, as well as issues around HUD and rent, as well as consumer protection, taxes, and student loans. And then from there, I went on to work for the New Jersey legislature. So I worked stateside. I was the deputy chief of staff to an assemblywoman there, where I worked on issues mainly of millionaires tax, as well as legalization of marijuana. And then from there, I actually worked on the grassroots side, where I was the legislative director for New Jersey families, where I worked a lot on pro-democracy issues. It's a little known fact, but New Jersey has their own unique style of voter suppression known as the ballot line. It's where establishment Democrats basically have manufactured a democracy for themselves in which their candidates always win and real progressive champions and champions of the people always lose. And so I really worked on that issue a lot during my time at Working Families. And then I went on to become the first dean of movement building at an organization called Movement School that teaches folks from marginalized backgrounds how to run campaigns. So, pretty robust, career there. But, I think taking the skills from all of those places, I know that I'm ready to really get to Congress and really get to work and work for the people of this district in ways that the current incumbent just simply isn't.
What's interesting to me about that, well, it's a great background, but Imani Oakley, part of what's interesting to me about that is that we've had Representative Pramila Jayapal on the program and others, and with Representative Jayapal, we had a great conversation about the relationship between movements and movement building, activism, and electoral politics. And, to me, it's a fascinating issue of, whether you call it inside, outside, or or whatever name you want to give it. The idea that it is possible to coordinate may be the wrong word, but to harmonize the two to create real change. She had some interesting thoughts about that, as you might imagine, and I'd love to know if you have some thoughts about that as well.
Yeah, for sure. I am a firm believer in the inside. I call it the inside outside game, because here's the thing: you need folks on the outside who are really shedding light on an issue, who are making noise about an issue on behalf of the people. You absolutely need that because, there may be something happening that for some reason is not getting covered by news media. Maybe it's just being missed, or for any other reason. You might have, just the powers that be not listening to folks on a certain issue. And so you need that outside organizing game to really help folks to recognize their own power and really lean into their power and say, hey, I am demanding that you give me XYZ thing. And I think that's really critically important so people both know what's going on and so people recognize their own power, because, a lot of people tend to see power as like this dirty word, because a lot of times people with a lot of power wield it in improper ways. But when people in our communities recognize their power, it can really make true transformative change. So I think it's really critical to have that outside game, but you also need a good inside game. You need people on the inside who sympathize and empathize and really believe in the values that are going on in the outside game, so that they are on the inside and they can work as gate openers as opposed to gatekeepers. Because if you only have all the good folks and all the good values on the outside, it's going to take a long time to bust down that gate. You need people on the inside who can open up that gate and say, hey, look at these outside folks. Listen to what they're saying. We need to be changing laws. We need to be changing things because they're right. And so I am a very, very firm believer in that. And I think I wouldn't say you can't do it, but it's a really difficult game if you only have one that's really, really strong and not the other. I think it's really critically important, especially in the times that we're in now, that we have both a strong outside and inside game.
And again, I'm talking with Imani Oakley, who is the Democratic challenger in New Jersey's 10th congressional district. So if you would, please tell us a little bit about your district. I described it to the best of my ability in the beginning, but tell us, give us the lay of the land, if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So we are in Northeast Jersey. And so the counties that spans are Hudson County, Union County, and Essex County. And you're right, some of the cities we have include Jersey City, as well as Newark, as well as some other smaller cities such as Irvington and Orange, as well as some suburban places such as Montclair and Maplewood. So I would say we're pretty much like half city, half suburb type of district. We're the only Black majority district in New Jersey, and we are a minority majority district, meaning most of our voters are Black and brown folks. And we also have a very strong immigrant population here, and it's beautiful. I mean, I think one of the special things about growing up here was that I really didn't notice this until I got to college and spoke to other folks who are, grew up in kind of less diverse places, about how many cultures I was able to interact with from a really young age. And I thought it was normal. And then I went to college and I was like, what? You've never, you've never eaten, South Asian food. You've never, been to a bar mitzvah. What? Like, what's going on? Like, so, I've had that breadth of experience and it's beautiful. But, like many districts throughout the country, we have some very serious issues, which is why I'm running for office. For example, again, we touched a little bit on the housing issue with regards to foreclosure, #1 in the country as of 2019. And I believe that only went down in 2020 because there was a moratorium placed on it due to COVID. But, I'm sure that if that had not happened, we would have continued on that same unfortunate path. But there's also a problem with the cost of rent as well. Rent is really, really skyrocketing in the area. I mean, even when I lived out in Newark for those few years, the rent would go up every few months. For 1-bedroom apartment studios, you'd be paying over $2,000 for a studio. And so, rent is also really getting out of control, and it's contributing to both gentrification as well as increasing homelessness. And it's a real issue here, one that I hope to combat. One of the things that I want to work on is bringing federal dollars from, from the federal government to help large municipalities and cities, one, place rent caps. We need to start seeing rent caps now because the rent is going up higher and higher and higher. And frankly, people not even moving into these complexes because nobody can afford it. So you have a bunch of empty units that nobody can afford. Doesn't make sense. I also want to bring dollars to large municipalities and cities that will bring their all developments made after 2018, make that 50% affordable housing. So that's 50 affordable housing. Right now, 30% is considered like the maximum amount, but that is just not enough to keep up with what we're seeing as far as people being pushed out and people being pushed onto the streets. So I want to bring federal dollars there. With regards to foreclosures, when I was a constituent advocate, I would often see banks sell a mortgage to like a private lender. And the private lender would then get that mortgage and slap all of these new fees on top of it. And the mortgage holder would then just get a notice that says, oh, hey, you have all of these new fees. Your new monthly payment is this much. And what would happen is when a person was paying on their house for like 30 years, raised kids in there, otherwise financially stable, right? So that argument about like, oh, well, you should have checked your finances absolutely did not even apply to them. They all of a sudden could not pay their mortgage because of all these new fees. And that practice is completely legal. So one of the things I want to do as a congresswoman is outlaw that practice because it really just hurts everyday people and it helps banks and lenders. And that's not really what we need to be about here. And so that's one thing. Another issue that we have going on in the district is also we have some serious issues regarding environmental concerns. We have very high rates of childhood asthma. I'm actually an asthmatic myself, and I was diagnosed with asthma at age 2. And so I do really understand this issue very intimately. And, it's because we have a lot of car emissions as well as non-electrified bus fleets and train fleets. That just gets worse in the summer because heat traps pollutants in the air. And we also have a severe issue with lead, not only in our water with old lead pipings, but also in the paint of old homes and apartment buildings, as well as in the soil, because we're an old like factory area. And if they were using lead for stuff, that got in the soil. And it's a really, really expensive process to fix. You actually have to uproot the lead-filled soil and put down new soil. And so I I am a firm advocate in the Green New Deal. It is time that we start employing people with good paying union jobs to make sure that we are changing our infrastructure to make it more green. So that's number one. But number two, I also want to work on bringing federal dollars because it's not going to be enough when we have to fix those lead issues in the piping and in the soil and in homes, and we have to electrify fleets. That's going to take a lot more than just municipal money. It's going to take a lot more than just state money. There's going to need to be the help of the federal to really fix those issues once and for all. And I want to make sure that I'm getting in there and fighting for those things.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but you've already laid out so many things, any one of which we could take a detour and talk about at length. Imani Oakley. One of them that I did want to go back to is I'm also an asthmatic and developed it in my early teens. My first attack, I almost died actually. So I relate to that, and I've studied the disparities in childhood asthma among the figures I've seen. There's different research, but a black child in this country, depending on which report I've looked at, is 7 to 10 times more likely to die of asthma than a white child in this country, which is just such grotesque injustice. But of course, no child should have untreated asthma. No child should live in an environment where the asthma is either triggered or worsened or caused or whatever. So, I strongly support that. I strongly support rent control. My grandfather was an immigrant, a tailor, raised a family of 3 in New York City in a 2-bedroom apartment, right, with on a tailor's income because there was rent control. That was part of the American dream. So you've touched on a million things I think that our listeners on this program really care about. And I guess I would want to ask you, going for, well, one question I know our viewers and listeners are going to wonder about is where does, in your thinking, Medicare for all or something like that fit into all of this?
Oh yeah, so I'm glad you got to that because I was going to segue off of what
All
you
right.
just said to talk about that too, because you know there's the cause of asthma, which are all these environmental concerns, right? But then
Right.
there's the cause of death, which is not being able to afford asthma medication. A asthma pump without insurance, and I've lived without insurance, so I'm not talking just like from just out of the air here. I've actually experienced not being able to afford my asthma medication, and one inhaler costs around $250 for one inhaler. And so you can imagine for a family that really isn't wealthy, that's like groceries for a month. That's a
Sure.
lot of other things. If this rent is skyrocketing, that's things that partially go to rent, right? And that's for one life-saving prescription. So I 100% am in favor of Medicare for all. I also use an EpiPen. I need an EpiPen for bee stings, shellfish, and peanuts, all nuts really. And the EpiPen is around $300 per
My
pen.
wife carries an EpiPen. We found the same thing. It went way up. It was like $50 or something. Now it's gone up. And by the way, I'm Imani. Excuse me for this, but check out this bad boy. This is my travel version of my nebulizer, right? So those are not cheap, and the stuff you put in it is definitely not cheap. So people don't seem to, I'll say something controversial within Democratic circles and see what your thoughts are. I feel, I have a background in health economics. I've been, on different task forces or whatever. I feel as if a lot of people on the Democratic side of the fence, policymakers, advisors, consultants, politicians, don't get the everyday economics of healthcare in this country. That they'll say things, oh, you should pay 9% of your income for premiums for health insurance that then you got to pay 5,000 out of pocket or whatever. They don't realize what that means when you're making $75,000 a year between the two of you and trying to raise three kids and pay your mortgage or your rent. They don't realize that you're talking about the kind of money that can drive people under financially if the slightest thing goes wrong. It's a disaster. And I feel as if, yeah, sure, it's better to have what we've passed than not to have it, but that I feel that there's a huge deficiency there that a lot of people on this side of the partisan divide don't fully grasp on a gut level. But what do you think?
No, I completely agree with that. And I think this really speaks to the fact that we have too many rich people in Congress and not enough everyday folks getting in there and legislating. Because, I've talked to folks who have never lived without money, who were born into families that were well off. And it really just didn't dawn on them how expensive it is to be working class and how expensive it is to
Right.
be poor. And, it's really simple things that you probably wouldn't even think twice about when you're well off. Are actually things that you really have to meticulously budget around and may have to go without some things and make choices as to, all right, this month, we gave up that necessity. So now we need to go back and get that necessity and just constantly finagling and budgeting. And it's very stressful because they're not like budgeting like, oh, do I go to, and hang out at the beach this weekend, or do I, travel overseas this summer, right? It's not
Right.
that type of budgeting. It's like, oh, what do I have to cut out with regards to groceries so that I can afford this life-saving medication, right? It's a lot more stressful. And I think that because we have a Congress right now that is mostly filled with people who are well off and have mostly lived well off for the majority of their lives, they really don't understand the everyday person, which is, part of why I'm running. I'm really running to represent the working class people of this district who are continually left out, but have these very real problems that they need an active fighter in Congress to fix.
Well, I am Annie Oakley. There are going to be people, I know they're out there, I'm sure you've encountered them too, who will say, well, 10th District, New Jersey, there's a Democrat in there. What's the problem? Why do you have to challenge them? There are a lot of establishment Democrats in Washington who raise money against people like you because they don't think that Democrats should be challenged in the primary. I think if you have democracy in your name, you shouldn't be objecting to democracy. That's my personal view. But there are people with that opinion. And what do you say to people who say, well, Donald Payne Jr., the incumbent, he's a Democrat. Why put energy into challenging him?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. And I have been talking to folks who do say that. So you're right. And what I would say is this: we just came out of 4 years of devastation of Donald Trump. Before that, we came out of years of the economic and housing crisis. And literally, my entire life, I don't remember when we weren't in some type of war or conflict. Right now, we need people in Congress who will get there and go to work and be real voices and champions for the values that we as Democrats espouse. My opponent has one of the worst attendance rates out of all of Congress. And that's a shame, right? We need people who are going to be active and rebuilding. My opponent also last fundraising quarter took money from ExxonMobil, as well as an oil pipeline, as well as Merck, so big pharma. And again, we need people who are not going to be beholden to these corporate entities that are perfectly okay with destroying our environment for a buck, that are perfectly okay with putting our health at risk and our livelihood at risk for a buck. And we need to rebuild and recognize that this country is really at a crossroads. We can choose to really turn things around at this point. I mean, Donald Trump really, awakened folks to how many things needed to be changed. And don't get me wrong, they always need to be changed years before Donald Trump. But I think he really woke folks up a lot to that. And we need to really recognize what happened there and start taking very serious and rapid steps to change this country around, or else we're gonna see a lot more of the flooding that we've seen, a lot more of the fires that we're seeing out west, a lot more of childhood asthma. We're going to be seeing a lot more of those things. So we need to have real champions who will get in there and be real voices for change and actively work for everyday people. And that's why I'm running. And I'm sure the voters will see that. And I'm confident we will get that win in June.
Well, Imani, Oakley, there are going to be people. I know they're out there. I'm sure you've encountered them too, who will say, well, 10th District, New Jersey, there's a Democrat in there. What's the problem? Why do you have to challenge them? There are a lot of establishment Democrats in Washington who raise money against people like you because they don't think that Democrats should be challenged in the primary. I think if you have democracy in your name, you shouldn't be objecting to democracy. That's my personal view. But there are people with that opinion. And what do you say to people who say, well, Donald Payne Jr., the incumbent, he's a Democrat. Why put energy into challenging him?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a great question. And I have been talking to folks who do say that. So you're right. And what I would say is this: we just came out of 4 years of devastation of Donald Trump. Before that, we came out of years of the economic and housing crisis. And literally, my entire life, I don't remember when we weren't in some type of war or conflict. Right now, we need people in Congress who will get there and go to work and be real voices and champions for the values that we as Democrats espouse. My opponent has one of the worst attendance rates out of all of Congress. And that's a shame, right? We need people who are going to be active and rebuilding. My opponent also last fundraising quarter took money from ExxonMobil, as well as an oil pipeline, as well as Merck, so big pharma. And again, we need people who are not going to be beholden to these corporate entities that are perfectly okay with destroying our environment for a buck, that are perfectly okay with putting our health at risk and our livelihood at risk for a buck. And we need to rebuild and recognize that this country is really at a crossroads. We can choose to really turn things around at this point. I mean, Donald Trump really, awakened folks to how many things needed to be changed. And don't get me wrong, they always need to be changed years before Donald Trump. But I think he really woke folks up a lot to that. And we need to really recognize what happened there and start taking very serious and rapid steps to change this country around, or else we're gonna see a lot more of the flooding that we've seen, a lot more of the fires that we're seeing out west, a lot more of childhood asthma. We're going to be seeing a lot more of those things. So we need to have real champions who will get in there and be real voices for change and actively work for everyday people. And that's why I'm running. And I'm sure the voters will see that. And I'm confident we will get that win in June.
So Politico, which is kind of the, I don't know, I think of it as one of the trade papers of the politics industry. And, I don't mean that as negative as it sounds. It's, they do a lot of good reporting. But Politico says you have an uphill battle. That even though, I will quote from it, so they say, any challenge to Payne will be an uphill battle. While he raises little money and has received some embarrassing headlines recently, showing up to a virtual hearing in his underwear, I watched that video, and voting almost entirely remotely for the past year and a half, someone with the surname Payne, P-A-Y-N-E, has represented the 10th Congressional District since the late 1980s. And I want to ask you about this specifically. And Payne is all but guaranteed to run on the coveted party line, which will give him advantageous placement on the ballot. I guess I want to get to the first part of it, of the uphill battle, but I guess that second sentence is what you were referring to earlier about some of the ways that New Jersey... tell us about that. I'm trying to figure that out.
Yeah, for sure. So New Jersey actually has the most corrupt ballot design in the entire nation. And it sounds like a huge exaggeration when I say that. It's actually not. We are the only state that uses this form of ballot. And how it works is like this. The Democratic Party picks who they want to be on what they call the ballot line, which is this long column of names of all establishment-backed Democrats, with the most popular name at the top. And typically people who are chosen to be on that line don't get there because, they have the best policy ideas or because they're the most active in their community. They typically get there because, one, they either donate a lot of money to the party and then they knock on a local party boss's door and say, hey, I want a seat in office. And they're like, oh, well, you donated a lot of money. Sure, why not? Or the other way they do it, and this way is particularly, disheartening because this is the way that typically Black and brown folks kind of get swept up into the system. You take a working class Black and brown person who, is interested in politics, wants to get out there, and they'll put them on a regulatory commission or a board where they make a lot of money, likely more money than they've seen in their lives. A lot of these boards and commissions, you have like 6-figure salaries. And what will happen is it'll completely transform their lives. They're able to buy houses, take care of their kids, take care of their parents. And then one day a party boss comes and knocking on their door and says, hey, remember that favor I did you where I got you this job that completely transformed your life? Well, now I need you to pass this particular legislation or this particular regulatory thing so that it can benefit me. And, you'll keep having this job and, we'll work out something else in the future. And then if that person who's sitting on that regulatory commission says yes, then what will happen is they call that being loyal. And when you show loyalty and you want to run for office, they say, you know what, you've been loyal. We'll put you on this party line. So essentially, voters have no say in who goes on this line whatsoever. And there was a study done by a Princeton professor who also works at Rutgers as well. Her name is Julia Sass-Rubin, in partnership with New Jersey Policy Perspective. They did a study to see what type of advantage this gives party favorites. And it's in the double digits, which when you're running a race anywhere else in the country, if you beat somebody by double digits, you did your job, man. Like you really, wipe the floor with them. But in New Jersey, people who are backed by the machine automatically get that without even campaigning, just simply because of their ballot placement. And so what that means when it says I have an uphill battle is because I certainly am not going to be on the machine's ballot line. Number one, I'm not a big donor. I'm a working class person, so I'm not throwing money at the party. But number two, I'm also not a yes person. I have criticized the party here. I actually started a podcast called Upfront Now that was dedicated to exposing the various things that the New Jersey political machine was doing that wasn't on the up and up. So I won't be on that. So my supporters are going to have to look for me out in what they call ballot Siberia, which is where they place progressives and challengers, and it's on random places on the ballot. So, the most gross example of this was in 2020, where you had Joe Biden actually received the party line, and then it was Booker under him, and then on down. And you had Bernie Sanders in random places on the ballot. So, and this also changes by county, by the way. So it could be in one county and your ballot looks different from another county. And Bernie Sanders was out in ballot Siberia by himself. And now somebody with the name ID as high as Bernie Sanders, right? People are confused about that because they'll actually look for that name. But if you're a progressive challenger and you're doing a grassroots campaign and your name ID isn't at that level of Bernie Sanders, it's easy for voters to miss you because voters typically, their eyes tend to go right to that long column. And so, again, this creates voter confusion. It creates voter suppression in the sense that I've actually talked to voters when canvassing for other progressive candidates in the past who say, I don't even vote in New Jersey anymore. The same people always win no matter what you do. I don't even vote. So it creates voter confusion about like, who can I vote for, where, why is this column over here? This person's also a Democrat. Can I vote for them? But it also creates a sense of why even go to the polls when the same people are automatically going to win. And so that's the uphill battle that's being referred to in that article. But with that being said, I actually started an initiative called the People's Ballot Initiative, where I go around and talk to everyday folks about the ballot design, because one thing that I've noticed is it's the best kept secret in the New Jersey politics sphere. People who are steeped in politics know all about it, but everyday voters typically do not. And so I started getting out the voter education on that. And it's really, really effective. Once people see the example of New Jersey's ballot design versus a good ballot design, they immediately get it. And they are immediately against, the way our ballot is set up. And so I'm going to continue doing that voter education throughout the course of my campaign to make sure that by the time we get to June, voters are fully educated on this ballot and why it's bad for them and why it's bad for their communities. And I'm sure that uphill battle will become very, very flat in by the time we get to June. So I'm confident in that.
And we've seen enough headlines over the last few years of the uphill battle or impossible progressive challenger situation where it's turned out the other way. So I'm Imani Oakley. Where can people go to find out more about your campaign, and maybe, send you a few bucks or whatever you need to keep going?
Yeah, definitely. So they can go to oakleyforcongress.com. That's the word for FOR. So that's oakleyforcongress.com. You can also find us on all social media on the handle at Imani, IMANI, Oakley, OAKLEY, NJ10 on all social media. And please, if you can, drop us $25, $50. We really have to raise. I'm not taking money from corporate PACs, nor lobbyists, nor developers. So those grassroots dollars really mean a lot. And thank you all for your support.
And it's Oakley like Annie Oakley, right? I'm sure you've heard that a million times. I don't hide my opinions usually, and I think you're fantastic. I love you. I think you're great, and I'm going to send you some money, and I'm going to talk you up as much as I can to anybody who'll listen, and I'll encourage folks to support you, and hopefully you'll come back at some point and let us know how the campaign's going.
Definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. I just want one promise from you that when you win, you will come back on the program and talk about that.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
All right. I'm Imani Oakley, candidate for Congress in the 10th Congressional District of New Jersey. Thanks for what you're doing, and thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.